In the front line of a digital revolution, the Chrome Vanguard stands as the last line of defense against the fading light. Witness the journey of those who lead with courage and shield the world with their unbreakable resolve. Hit subscribe now and join the elite ranks of the future. Call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock in the conference room, watching the second hand drag itself around the face while my business partner Lawrence talked about Q3 projections. We were closing a defense contract worth $240 million. The kind of deal that changes the shape of a company. The kind of night where you're supposed to be present, sharp, locked in. My phone buzzed. My son's number. I almost let it go to voicemail. He was 22, a sophomore at UT Austin. He called maybe twice a month, usually on Sunday afternoons when he needed money for something he was too embarrassed to ask his mother about. He knew I was in a meeting. He wouldn't call unless I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. "Hey, what's up?" It wasn't him. It was a man's voice, low, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. "Your boy says hi." My spine turned to concrete. "Who is this?" "You know who this is, General?" I hadn't been a general in 6 years. I'd built Herwick Defense Solutions from a rented office in Arlington into one of the top private defense contractors in the country. We had 400 employees, 3 government contracts, a house in McLean I barely lived in, and someone had my son's phone. "Let me talk to him." A pause. Then I heard it, a sound that I will carry in my chest for the rest of my life. My son making a noise that no 22-year-old should ever make. Like something had been broken that you can't see from the outside. The call ended. I stood in that hallway for approximately 4 seconds. Then I went back into the conference room, told Lawrence there was a family emergency, and walked to my car. I called my ex-wife from the parking garage. She didn't pick up. I called again. She didn't pick up. I called a third time and she answered on the last ring before voicemail. Her voice was flat, measured, the way she used to sound when she was managing something she didn't want me to know about. "I heard about Jackson," she said. Before I could speak, before I said a word, I heard about Jackson. Not what happened to Jackson. Not what happened to Jackson. Not, "Oh God, what's going on?" Not the sound of a mother being told something terrible about her child. She already knew. I asked her where he was. She said she didn't know. I asked her who those people were. She said I should calm down and think about this rationally. I asked her one more time, "Where is our son?" And she said very quietly that Jackson had made certain choices and that sometimes choices have consequences. Then she hung up. I sat in that parking garage for a long time, long enough for the automated lights to switch off and leave me sitting in the dark. I'm not the kind of man who panics. 31 years of service, 2 combat deployments, Ranger qualified, Joint Special Operations Command. I have made decisions in situations where panic meant body bags. But this was my son. This was Jackson. He was 7 years old when I deployed to Kandahar. He used to sleep with a photograph of me in his pillowcase because his mother told him it would keep me safe. And he believed her. He was the kind of kid who believed things. Too open. Too trusting. Too willing to see the best in people. I used to worry about that. The world doesn't reward that kind of openness. I tried to tell him that. I wish I'd spent less time trying to tell him things, and more time just being there. I tracked his phone through the family account we still shared. The GPS put him at an address on the east side of San Antonio. Industrial District. A place called Ironworks Road. I pulled it up on satellite view. A large building with a gravel lot. No signage. 3 trucks in a cluster of motorcycles parked out front. I knew what that building was. I'd been briefed on the Vargrave Syndicate 2 years earlier by a contact at the DEA, not because they were involved in anything that touched my contracts. They weren't. But because they operated in 3 states and had their fingers in port logistics, which bumped up against supply chain security in ways that occasionally mattered. Mid-level organized crime. Violent, territorial, run by a man named Dirk Vargrave, who had somehow avoided federal indictment for 11 years by staying just far enough below the threshold that made you worth the paperwork. 43 members, mostly ex-cons and drifters. The kind of organization that doesn't exist on paper. I did not call the police. Not because I couldn't, because I knew what would happen if I did. Best case, they'd send a unit to do a wellness check, and the Vargrave crew would stall them for 40 minutes while they moved Jackson somewhere else. Worst case, and this was the more likely scenario given what my ex-wife had just said to me, whoever I called was already on someone's payroll. She'd said it so calmly. Choices have consequences. She knew. She had known before I called, which meant she'd known before I called, which meant she'd known before it happened, which meant she had given someone information about our son, his location, his routine, something, and she had done it deliberately. I drove home. I have a storage unit in Chantilly that I'd maintained for 15 years. The contents are not illegal. They are also not the sort of thing you keep in a house where guests come and go. I spent 45 minutes there. When I left, I had what I needed. I also called a man named Birch, former ranger, current private security contractor. I had used him on 3 overseas operations during my last year of active duty. We had an understanding. I said I needed someone on the ground in San Antonio by 0400. He said he'd need a number. I gave him one. He said he'd be there. I flew commercially, booked under a different name, which is easier than people assume if you have the right documentation and have been doing it long enough. I landed at SAT at 2:15 a.m. Birch was waiting at the curb in a rented F-250. We drove to Ironworks Road and parked 2 blocks north. I told him the situation, all of it, including my ex-wife's reaction. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "So we're not calling this in?" "Not yet." "What's the play?" The building had one main entrance in front, a loading dock on the south side, and what appeared from satellite to be a fire exit on the north wall. The loading dock was the problem. It opened into an enclosed yard with a chain-link fence. The main entrance had 2 men outside. I could see them from where we were parked, small orange points of light where they were smoking. I said, "I need them all in one place." Birch said, "That's a lot of people." "I know. Jackson's in there." "He is. So we can't use the building." "No." We sat with that for a minute. The thing about my ex-wife. Her name is Sylvia, and I want to say her name because I think she should be named in this. The thing about Sylvia is that I spent 17 years married to her, and I still cannot tell you the exact moment she became someone I didn't recognize. It wasn't one moment. It was a slow drift, like a boat that doesn't seem to be moving until you look up and notice the shore is somewhere else entirely. She grew up with money and lost it. That's the simplest version. Her father's company collapsed when she was in college, and she spent the next decade performing a version of herself that she thought would get it back. She married me because I was ambitious, and she thought ambition was transferable. When I built a company, she was pleased. When the company started requiring more of me than she wanted to share, she became someone else's. I found out about the affair with a man named Grant Holloway 4 years into our marriage, and chose to stay because Jackson was 2 years old, and I believed in the institution of the thing, which is a mistake I own entirely. We divorced when Jackson was 16. The settlement was generous, more generous than my lawyers advised, because I wanted it over and I wanted Jackson to have stability. I did not know then what I know now, that Sylvia had been communicating with members of the Vargrave syndicate for at least 8 months before Jackson was taken, that Grant Holloway had gambling debts totaling somewhere north of $300,000 and had offered Sylvia's connections, meaning my son, meaning the leverage my son represented, as a way to settle them. I know all of this now because it came out later. That night, I only knew what her voice had told me, and her voice had told me enough. At 3:40 a.m., Birch cut the power line feeding the building from the utility pole on the east side of the block. It wasn't complicated. Nobody monitors utility poles at 3:40 a.m. The building went dark. The 2 men out front reacted the way undisciplined people react to the unexpected. They moved toward the problem, which meant they moved toward each other and away from the door. Birch handled them quietly and efficiently. I don't need to describe exactly how. They were not permanently harmed. They would wake up with headaches. I went through the main entrance. Inside, it smelled like motor oil and cigarettes, and something stale underneath both of those. Emergency lighting had kicked on somewhere in the back, casting the space in a dim orange glow. I could hear voices, men calling to each other in the dark, the shuffle of boots on concrete, someone telling someone else to find a flashlight. I moved along the east wall. There was a hallway off the main floor that led deeper into the building. I had studied the satellite image long enough to have a rough sense of the interior layout. Older industrial buildings follow patterns. The room I was looking for would be interior, away from windows, with a door that locked from the outside. I found it. The lock was a padlock through hasp. 45 seconds. I opened the door and Jackson was inside, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, wrists zip-tied in front of him. There was blood on his face from somewhere above his left eye. He looked up when I came in, and for a moment he didn't seem to understand what he was seeing. Then he said, "Dad," just like that, flat and exhausted and with so much behind it that I couldn't speak for a moment. I cut the zip ties. I told him we were leaving. He said his knee was hurt, and I told him it didn't matter, and I helped him up and we moved. Birch was waiting at the south wall with the fire exit held open. We were in the truck in under 4 minutes from the moment I'd cut the power. We drove to the hospital first. Jackson had a broken orbital bone, 2 cracked ribs, and a ligament tear in his right knee. He also had a concussion. He was admitted at 4:55 a.m., and I sat in the plastic chair next to his bed, and I held it together until the nurse left the room, and then I did not hold it together for approximately 3 minutes, which was as long as I allowed myself. Then I made phone calls. The first call was to a lawyer in Washington named Hutchins, who specialized in federal criminal matters and who owed me a favor from a situation in 2019 that I will not detail here. I told him what I knew about Sylvia and Grant Holloway and the Vargrave Syndicate. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "How solid is your evidence? I have her phone records going back 8 months. A pause. How do you have that? Because I paid for the account. He said he'd make some calls. The second call was to my contact at the DEA. His name isn't important. I told him I had a direct link between the Vargrave Syndicate and a kidnapping for leverage over a federal defense contractor, and that I had documentation suggesting local law enforcement contacts may have been compromised. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Send me what you have." I sent him what I had. What followed over the next 72 hours is complicated, and I won't pretend I had full visibility into all of it. I know that federal warrants were executed on the Vargrave property on Ironworks Road 2 days after I pulled Jackson out of that building. I know that 14 members of the syndicate were arrested, including 3 who had direct involvement in what happened to my son. I know that the investigation turned up evidence of the compromised local contacts, 2 officers and a dispatcher who had been receiving payments for 8 years. I know that Sylvia was arrested at her condo in Austin on a Thursday afternoon. I know that Grant Holloway was arrested at an airport in Phoenix attempting to board a flight to Cancun. I know that both of them pled not guilty at their arraignment and that both of them, in subsequent months, changed those pleas. I was in the courthouse the day Sylvia was sentenced. 18 years for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, obstruction, and a federal charge related to the compromised defense contract connections. I did not feel what I expected to feel when the judge read the sentence. I had expected something, satisfaction maybe, or closure, or one of those clean words people use for the ends of hard things. What I actually felt was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that settles into the architecture of you and becomes part of how you carry yourself from one day to the next. Jackson was in the courtroom. He was on crutches from the knee surgery. He sat 2 rows behind me, and we didn't speak during the proceedings. But at one point, I turned around, and he was looking at me, and he nodded once, and I nodded back, and that was enough. He transferred to a university in Virginia the following semester to be closer. He calls more than twice a month now. He doesn't always have a reason. Sometimes he just calls to talk, which is something we had to learn how to do. The talking without a reason. The contact for its own sake. I am better at some things than others. I am working on this. People ask me if I regret not going through official channels from the start. Waiting for the police, filing a report, letting the system move at the speed the system moves. I think about those 4 seconds in the hallway. The sound my son made on that phone call. The flatness in Sylvia's voice when she said choices have consequences. I ran the math that night in the parking garage. I knew what the variables were. I knew what the acceptable margin of error was. There was no acceptable margin of error was. There was no acceptable margin of error. I would make the same call again. I would make it faster. The defense contract closed 3 weeks after Jackson was released from the hospital. Lawrence handled most of the final negotiations. He's good at that. The patience of it. The back and forth. I'm better at the part where you look at a situation, identify what's broken, and move. The company is doing well. Jackson started physical therapy in January, and his knee is close to full strength. He's thinking about law school, which I did not suggest and would not have suggested, but which I find privately extremely fitting. Some nights I drive past the storage unit in Chantilly, and I think about what's inside it. The things I needed and then didn't. I think about the fact that I built an entire career around protecting people I'd never met, people I'd never know, abstractions of national interest and strategic security. And then one night, the only thing that mattered was one kid on the floor of a dark room with his wrists zip-tied. I got him out. That's the whole story. That's all of it. I've thought about Sylvia a lot since the sentencing. Not with anger. That burned off a long time ago. More with a kind of exhausted clarity, the way you feel after you finally understood something you should have seen years earlier. She made a choice, a deliberate one. She looked at her own son, Jackson, 22 years old, a kid who still called her on her birthday, who defended her to me more times than I ever asked him to. And she decided he was a useful piece to move. That's not impulsiveness. That's not desperation in a single bad moment. That took planning. That took a sustained willingness to see a person you created as a thing you could trade. And the thing about that kind of choice is that it doesn't arrive fully formed. It grows. It starts with small compromises. The truth you shade. The loyalty you sell in increments so small you can tell yourself it doesn't count. Grant Holloway didn't walk into Sylvia's life and turn her into someone who could do what she did. She walked toward him, one small step at a time, over years. The person who sat in that courtroom and heard 18 years read aloud was the sum of every decision she'd made since the first time she chose convenience over integrity. I'm not saying this to be cruel to her memory. I'm saying it because I think it's the most important thing I've learned from this entire ordeal. The choices you make when no one is watching, when the stakes seem low, when the consequences feel abstract, those are the choices that build the architecture of who you actually are, not who you tell yourself you are, not the version of yourself you present in rooms where it matters, the real one, the one that shows up when the pressure gets high enough that the performance can't hold. Jackson asked me once, about 2 months after he was out of the hospital, whether I thought she'd known what they were going to do to him specifically. Not just that he'd be used as leverage. The specific things that happened in that building. I told him I didn't know. Which was true. He was quiet for a while. Then he said he'd decided it didn't change anything for him either way. That the part he had to figure out how to live with wasn't what she knew or didn't know. It was the fact that she'd handed him over at all. That the calculation had happened to Drand. I thought that was one of the wisest things I'd ever heard a 22-year-old say. Smarter, honestly, than most of what I said at his age. He cut straight to the thing that mattered and he let the rest go. That's a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from school. It comes from having to sit with something real and find the edge of it. What I did that night, flying to San Antonio, cutting the power, going through that door, I've had people ask me if it was brave. I don't think it was brave. Brave implies you overcame fear. I wasn't afraid. I was operating. There's a difference. Fear is what happens when you don't know what to do. I knew exactly what to do. Every year of training, every decision I'd made over 3 decades, had been preparation for a moment where the math was that simple. My son was in that building, and I was going to get him out. The harder thing, the thing that actually required something from me, was sitting in that plastic hospital chair afterward and letting myself feel what it had cost. Not strategically, not in a way I could manage or contain, just feeling it. That's the part nobody trains you for.